Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. My name is Paul Harris and I am president of the City Club's Board of Directors. I am very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Ted Gup, renowned journalist, chair of the Department of Journalism for Emerson College in Boston, and author of A Secret Gift. We'll hear more about that in a minute. Mr. Gup earned his Bachelor of Arts degree from Brandeis University and a Doctor of Jurisprudence degree from Case Western Reserve University School of Law. He began his distinguished journalism career as a reporter for the Akron Beacon Journal. He next held reporting positions at Time Magazine and the Washington Post, where he was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. While at the Washington Post, he was mentored by legendary investigative reporter Bob Woodward. He assumed the chair position at Emerson College following a 10-year teaching stint at Case Western Reserve University. Mr. Gup has authored two books dealing with matters of secrecy in the government, Nation of Secrets, The Threat to Democracy in the American Way of Life, and the Book of Honor, Covert Lives and Classified Deaths at the CIA. Those works have been recognized, among other things, for addressing the impact of government secrecy on our democracy. Most recently, Mr. Gup has authored, as previously mentioned, A Secret Gift, How One Man's Kindness and a Trove of Letters Revealed the Hidden History of the Great Depression. This book is an investigative account about the Great Depression with a very uniquely personal connection to its author. Mr. Gup has performed freelance work with a variety of publications, including the New York Times, Sports Illustrated, and National Geographic, and he is a frequent guest on network programs, including on CNN, PBS, and NPR. His numerous awards for excellence in journalism include the George Polk Award for Foreign Reporting, the Worth Bingham Prize for Investigative Journalism, the Gerald Loeb Award, and the Book of the Year Award from the Investigative Reporters and Editors. His work, Nation of Secrets, earned the 2008 Goldsmith Book Prize. He has been recognized as a Fulbright Scholar, MacArthur Fellow, and a Guggenheim Fellow. So this is a pretty special fellow that you're about to hear from today. I'm pleased to present on behalf of the City Club of Cleveland, Ted Gup, Chair of the Department of Journalism at Emerson College and author of A Secret Gift.
Thank you, Paul. It's a joy to be back in Cleveland, it really is, and it's an honor to have you share with me this very esteemed forum. This is one of the most prestigious and honored forums in the country, as you know, so it's a joy to be here. I came with a story, and I want to talk to you about the Great Depression. It's not going to be a surprise to any of you that we're in difficult times now. We know that. I don't know if you know this or not, but there are 15 million Americans out of work right now. And that is the very number who were out of work in the depths of the Great Depression, 15 million. The difference is that back then it represented about 25% of the workforce, and today it's about 9.8% of the workforce. But that's not a lot of comfort to the 15 million that are out of work. So these are difficult times. But I didn't come to talk to you about the difficult times. I came to talk to you about the hard times. The hard times, the ones that were capitalized, that began in 29 and stretched for a very long decade, straight through the 30s. And I can see in the audience there will be people here that will know this subject not only academically, but through life experiences. In my hometown of Canton, Ohio, in 1933, unemployment was about 50%. And that was a common number in industrial-based cities in this state, 50%. We don't know the exact number, and it didn't really matter because there was no one to help them anyhow. You know, if it was 40% or 60%, there was no one to come to the rescue because there was no Social Security, Medicaid, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or any of the nets that we think of that could catch us in hard times. You fell, the only thing that caught you was the pavement. And that's how it was. I'm going to take you back to the week of Christmas, 1933, in my hometown of Canton, Ohio. Unemployment 50%, kids along the railroad tracks picking up pieces of coal that fell from passing trains, putting them in burlap bags, taking them home, trying to stay warm that night. No beds at home. They'd been repossessed or sold. Oftentimes, no blankets. They huddled together on the floor. No furniture, oftentimes, just orange crates to sit on. Those were hard times. And it was that week that someone took out an ad in the local paper, the Canton Repository. Tiny little ad, about the size of a deck of playing cards. And to paraphrase the ad, it said, "If you're hurting, you write to me, tell me what you're going through, and I'll try to help you in a modest way before Christmas. Write to me, Mr. B. Verdot. Not my real name. You'll never know who I am. No one will ever know who you are, those of you that write to me." Not surprisingly, hundreds of letters came in, maybe thousands. The front page of the repository ran a story about this offer. It was so electrifying, and word of it spread for hundreds of miles. And a couple days later, 150 checks for $5 went out to families across the town. Now, $5 adjusted for inflation is about $100 today, between $80 and $100. It was more money than most folks had seen in memory. The new minimum wage was 30 cents an hour, but most folks, if they made $1 a day, felt mighty lucky. So Beaver Dot's generosity found its way into 150 homes, and people speculated who he might be. They all knew he was a good Christian. He wished them a joyous Christmas. They thought maybe he was the scion of one of the privileged families, Hoover, Belden, Timken, but they didn't know. The years passed. His identity did not surface, nor did the identity of those who wrote to them. The years became decades, and in time, the beneficiaries went to their graves, and so too did Beaver Dot. And that's where the story ends. Well, not quite, because if it ended there, I wouldn't be here. Right? So, 2 years ago, my mother handed me an old suitcase, a battered old black suitcase, and she said, "I don't know what's in here, but you're welcome to it." A couple days later, I opened it up, and inside were hundreds of letters, all of them dated December 1933, and a stack of checks, 150 canceled checks, all of them signed Beaver Dot. Now, I had no idea what I was looking at. It took me several days, and then in the bottom of the suitcase, I found a front-page story from the Canton Repository that described the gift in detail, and then I realized Beaver Dot was my grandfather, Sam Stone. And the name Beaver Dot was a combination of his three daughters, Barbara, Virginia, and Dorothy, who is known as Dotsy. So my mother is the Ver in Beaver Dot. I didn't think of writing a book then, or an article. I didn't think about doing anything with it. I didn't have my author's hat on. I had my grandson's hat on. And it was actually months before I thought of writing about it. And when I did, I set out on two parallel tracks which converged. One was, why did my grandfather make this gift? And two, what happened to these people that wrote to him? And I want to speed through the reason why my grandfather made this gift, but it's important that you understand. I had known growing up that he was born in Pittsburgh. I had his birth certificate, 1888 Pittsburgh, and the passports that confirmed it. But in the course of my research, I discovered they were all fraudulent documents, that he wasn't born in Pittsburgh. And I found his name on a passenger list. 1902, he entered the country as a refugee from Romanian pogroms, from a little town called Dorohoi in Romania. And he came to this country at age 15. He was an Orthodox Jew who spoke only Yiddish and kept kosher. So much for the secret Santa. He got off the ship, he changed his name sometime later, stopped keeping kosher, stopped speaking Yiddish. And it's clear to me that one of the reasons he made this gift is because he wanted to thank America for taking him in, for providing him a home, for accepting him. And you will remember 1933 as the year that Hitler came to power. And he was keenly aware of that given his background. So it was a very special place to be safe and have a home. So now let me tell you about some of the folks that wrote to him. They came from every walk of life that you could possibly imagine. Bellhops, butchers, bakers, the fellow that repaired the steeples on the churches, elderly widows, little girls as young as 12, school children, and fallen executives. One of these was one of Canton's most prominent businessmen, a fellow named George Monnet. And George Monnet was very prescient because 2 years after Henry Ford incorporated his Ford dealership, his Ford manufacturer, Henry Monnet created a dealership. And within years, he had 1,200 cars in his showroom. He owned a whole city block, this showroom. And how successful was he? Well, he had his own orchestra that dressed in tuxes and was named for the dealership. He had a summer home. He had a small yacht. He helped start the country club. And his wife, Alice, was one of the most prominent socialites in the city. Then came 1929. You may remember that year, or at least have read about it. He lost everything. Okay? And 4 years later, 4 years into the Great Depression, with at least 6 more to go, he had absolutely nothing. And he saw this ad, and he wrote to Mr. Beaverdot. Let me share with you his letter. Dear Sir, your interesting and benevolent article appearing in the repository prompted me to write and advise how the Depression left the writer. For 26 years was in the automobile business, prosperous at one time, and have done more than my share in giving at Christmas and at all times. Have a family of 6, and struggle is the word for me now for a living. Christmas will not mean much to our family this year, as my business, bank, real estate, insurance policies are all swept away. Our resources are nil at present. Perhaps my situation is no different than hundreds of others. However, a man who knows what it is to be up and down can fully appreciate the spirit of one who has gone through the same ordeal. You are to be congratulated for your benevolence and kind offer to those who have experienced this trouble and such as the writer is going through. No doubt you will have a happy Christmas, as there is more real happiness in giving and making someone else happy than receiving. May I extend to you a very happy Christmas. George W. Monnet. And you can hear the dignity in his voice, and you can hear the pain of having to write this. A couple days later, he received a check for $5 from Mr. Beaverdot, and I must add that the handwriting on the check, the signature, was beautiful. It was not my grandfather's. He never got past the 2nd grade. It was my grandmother's signature. So a couple days later, Mr. Monnet wrote back a thank you note. My dear Mr. Beaverdot, permit me to offer my sincere thanks for your kind remembrance for a happy Christmas. Indeed, this came in very handy and was much appreciated by myself and family. It was put to good use, paying for 2 pairs of shoes for my girls and other little necessities. I hope someday I have the pleasure of knowing to whom we are indebted for this very generous gift. At present, I am not of employment, and it is very hard going. However, I hope to make some connection soon. I again thank you on behalf of the family, and an earnest wish is that you have a most happy New Year. Sincerely yours, George W. Monnet. Okay. And unlike the movies of Frank Capra, this one did not have a happy ending for George Monnet. He never recovered from the Great Depression. The man who had 1,200 cars could barely afford bus fare. He ended up working at a factory as a clerk, passed away from pancreatic cancer. And the only thing that he passed down was the large tool chest that he had when he put together Model Ts as a Ford dealer. And that is now in the hands of his grandson, Jeffrey, whose lifestyle more closely resembles his grandfather's before the Great Depression. He has a home on a golf course in England, a home in Oregon, a home in South Carolina. He's an avid collector of ancient Greek and Roman coins. He's a scuba diver, and he drives a Porsche and a Mercedes, but no Ford. The other footnote to the story is what became of the showroom. It went through a lot of different incarnations over the decades, but for many, many years, and this is by sheer luck, for many, many years, it has been a museum for classic cars. And right in the middle of it is a Model T Ford of precisely the vintage that George Monnet sold. So that's the footnote on George Monnet. I have a couple of other individuals I'd like to introduce you to, if I may. One of them is Howard Summers. Howard Summers wrote, all of these letters, by the way, were December 18th, 1933, the same day the ad appeared. These people did not waste any time. They saw an opportunity to provide for their families. And mind you, very few of these people asked for themselves. In most cases, they asked for their loved ones, for their neighbors, for family. Dear friend, Beaver Dot, as I picked up the evening paper, I saw your most generous offer to worthy people. I count myself and my wife most worthy, as for the last 4 years, I have only had a few days' work here and there. But I will go ahead and state the jobs my wife and I have had to do before we would ask for charity. Picking berries in season and selling them as late as 12 o'clock at night. Picking cherries on the share and selling our share. My wife had to climb to the tops of the highest trees, as I am lame and cannot climb. We have started as early as February to gather dandelions to sell, and sold them till May, or till people would not buy them any longer, as they were too tough to eat. Our wintertime job is gathering sassafras, which is a lot of hard work and not much money in it. The last 6 or 8 months I've been selling liquid solder, pills, and sturdy pencils in and about Canton, for about 10 miles around at nearby towns. But I found that selling house to house is a hard job, as scarce as money was. As far as clothes is concerned, I've had to buy a few things for myself, as I had to meet the public. But my wife has not had a coat in 7 years, and her last pair of shoes were bought in 1929. The coat is not fit to wear. We have always kept an old car, which was the only way we had to get our wood and coal and take us to country to pick our berries. Well, I think this is enough said, but I could sit here and write for hours, but 3 pages is enough. After you have read it over, and you are the judge, and you don't feel that we are worthy of your donation, secretly, as you promised then, please destroy this letter so no one will know but you and I. So goodbye and good luck, and we are living in hopes that good luck comes our way. Howard Summers. Now, there are a couple of things I want you to know. All of the letters, with one exception, that are included in this book are accompanied by a release from the family member, in keeping with the promise my grandfather made. There is one exception, and that is the letter I just read to you. And you can judge me if you want. I maybe made a mistake, but I decided to include it, and here's why. Howard Summers had no issue. He had no children. There was no one to seek out permission from. He also never recovered from the Great Depression. And you heard the weariness in that letter? He was 28 years old when he wrote that. And it felt to me that if I included his letter, it might give some meaning to what he endured. Because the only thing that is left of Howard Summers today is this letter. That's it. So I decided on my own to include it. The other letters are accompanied by releases. So let me read you the story, the letter, if I may, of Edith May. She was 39 when she wrote this. And she lived on a tumble-down farm just outside of Canton. So she had some concerns about whether she would be eligible for this gift. Again, December 18th, 33. Maybe I shouldn't write to you, not living right in Canton. But for some time, I've been wanting to know somebody who could give me some help. We have known better days. 4 years ago, we were getting $135 a month for milk. Now, Saturday, we got 12. This 12 has to go as follows. Pay for the gas to haul the milk, get chopping, pay for coal. During the cold spell, buy an axe to make wood, buy a tire for $1, and I had $2 to buy groceries. Imagine, 5 of us for a month. If I only had $5, I would think I am in heaven. I would buy a pair of shoes for my oldest boy in school. His toes are all out and no way to give him a pair. He was 6 in October. Then I have a little girl will be 4, 2 days before Christmas, and a boy of 18 months. I could give them all something for Christmas, and I would be very happy. Up to now, I haven't a thing for them. Now I want to read how this letter closes. I'm going to skip a portion of the letter. And oh my, I know what it is to be hungry and cold. We suffered so last winter, and this one is worse. Please do help me. My husband don't know I am writing, and I haven't even a stamp. But I'm going to beg the mailman to post this for me. Obligingly, Mrs. Edith May. I still get choked up reading that letter. That letter found its way to my grandfather's suitcase without a stamp. And it's the kind of small gesture that really made the Great Depression bearable. Why was she so susceptible to the cold? Because she was Jamaican. She grew up in Jamaica, didn't know the cold. And she fell in love, she was black, she fell in love with an African-American grandson of a slave in America through the mails. They were pen pals. And he went to Jamaica to meet her, they were married there, and he brought her back to this farm. I know this because I spoke with her daughter, Felice. And Felice had 2 stories to tell me about her. One, that skunk was the smell of money in their family, because the father would trap skunk and sell the pelts. And she said, we knew he was successful even before he got home. But there were times where he would come to the door and his eyes would be swollen shut from being sprayed directly. And her mother would have a pail of water at the ready to wash his eyes. The other thing that Felice told me was that her birthday was 2 days before Christmas. And Christmas and birthdays meant nothing to her because they did the chores and then they went to bed. That was their day, every day. She'd never seen the city lights, the Christmas lights. Only one birthday does she remember. They left the farm, they went into town, she saw the lights. It was the first time, and she remembers them to this day. And her mother took her to a 5 and dime and took her to the back where the toys were and said, this was the toy story, the toy section. They said, you can have a dolly or you can have this wooden horse. It had a pull string, it had wheels, a little platform. And Felice chose the horse. And it was her favorite toy, and indeed it was her only store-bought toy. And she pulled that all over the farm. And in the midst of our conversation, she said, you know, I was 4 years old that birthday, and until this moment, I never understood how it was that we could leave the farm in the depths of the Great Depression and afford to buy that pony. And now I understand. It was your grandfather's gift. She turned 4 and 33 that Christmas. And today, a little footnote, she raises miniature ponies. I found the descendants of all the letters except for one that I was seeking out, and that was Helen Palm. I couldn't find her. And I gave up. I had to give up. I had to turn in the book. It was edited, it was copywritten, and that was done. And I decided I'd make one more run at it. And after several hours, lo and behold, I found a daughter, Janet. And I interviewed her about her mother. And, you know, all of the letter writers have been dead, 149. This was the 150th. I was interviewing Janet. I said, when was your mother born? When did she marry? I was about to ask when she passed away, and she said, would you like to speak with her? And I couldn't believe it. The 150th letter writer was the only one still alive. And I spoke with her, and she was 14 when she wrote the letter. She was 91 when I spoke with her. And she remembered how she spent the money. She her shoes had so many holes in them that she'd taken a box of shredded wheat and cut the shape of her foot out of the cardboard and put it under her soles to keep the damp out and the cold. So she got herself a pair of patent leather shoes. Then she got an item of clothing for a brother and sister. And then just as she wrote in her letter, she took her parents out for Christmas. And that was $5. So let me, if I may, just read to you this brief letter. Dear Sir, now newspapers were 3 cents back then. And that was 3 cents they didn't have, so they borrowed them. They'd read the paper at their neighbors. Dear Sir, when we went over at the neighbors to borrow the paper, I read your article. I am a girl of 14. I am writing this because I need clothing, and sometimes we run out of food. My father does not want to ask for charity, but us children would like to have some clothing for Christmas. When he had a job, us children used to have nice things. I also have brothers and sisters. If you should send me the money, I would buy clothing and buy the Christmas dinner and supper. I thank you, Helen Palm. So she's the only one that lived long enough to learn the identity of Beaver Dot. And lo and behold, she knew who Sam Stone was because she and her father in the better days would go into his clothing store. He had a little store called Stone's Clothes, and they would buy ties there. And she said, that little man, that was Beaver Dot? Yep, that little man. So this is a local story about a very small gift. Deep into the story, as I was working on it, I decided I wanted to do something a little crazy. And so I decided I wanted to invite all of the descendants of the letter writers together in an old theater in Canton, Ohio. And so I extended invitations that went out literally across the country. And about a month ago, and a couple of you in this room were there, we had between 400 and 600 people gather in the Palace Theater in Canton, Ohio. And I had the descendants come on stage, a number of them, and read the letters and talk about their family. 91-year-old Helen Palm was there, but she wasn't the oldest. That was Betty Snively, who was hoisted up in a wheelchair by her 2 sons who were former Marines. It was wonderful. And the power of this gift, of this gesture, this story, this book is now being translated in Mandarin to be published in the People's Republic of China. It's being translated in Korean for South Korea, Italian for Italy, and other countries as well. And on Thanksgiving Day, an offer appeared in the Canton Repository, Thanksgiving Day this year. 3 anonymous businessmen got together and said, we want to make the same offer to 150 families for Christmas. If you will write to Beaver Dot, care of the Canton Repository, and they adjusted the gift for inflation. Instead of $5, it was $100. So it was $15,000 that they offered. And in the days since Thanksgiving, more than 170 other citizens have come forward. It is now $45,000 and growing by the day. That's the power of a small gesture. Thank you.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we are listening to a rather fascinating Friday forum featuring Ted Gup, chair of the Department of Journalism at Emerson College in Boston and author of A Secret Gift. We'll return to him in a moment for our traditional City Club questions. Please start formulating your questions now, and remember that your questions should be brief and to the point so that we can get as many questions as possible in. Members and guests alike are welcome to attend the City Club forums, and we certainly hope that everyone listening will join the City Club and become active in our ongoing civic dialogue. Please visit our website, that's www.cityclub.org, to see a full schedule of our upcoming programs. We welcome all of you here, and to those listening to WCPN 90.3 FM, WCLV, WTAM, or one of the many radio stations across the country. Our television broadcast partner is WVIZ PBS IdeaStream. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. Today is the Philanthropic Spirit and Community Leadership Forum, made possible by a generous gift from the Friends of James S. Liscombe. Joining us at the head table today are Barbara and William Liscombe and Hank Dahl. Will you please stand and be recognized? Thank you very much for your support. We are also pleased to welcome guests at a table hosted today by the law firm Baker & Hostetler. Thank you, too, for joining us today. Now we would like to return to our speaker for a traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphones today are City Club Marketing and Membership Manager Heather Sikora and Program Director Carrie Miller. First question, please.
To me, Ted Gup is actually always going to be Professor Gup because I had him as a professor at Case, and this is just what every day in class was like. He's one of the best speakers I've ever heard, and his writing is unbelievable. So I just want you to know you've always been an inspiration to everybody in the class. The question is, did you have anybody that when you did research, the story they told in the letter didn't quite sync up with the reality?
You always ask good questions. And you don't need to have you weren't sucking up for a grade, you got an A. He's a fabulous student. Yeah, sometimes the letters did not comport with the reality. More often, they didn't comport with the reality as known to the descendants. There were several instances in which the letters revealed that a parent, in all cases father, was in prison, either at the time the letter was written or had been in prison, and the children didn't know it. And that was quite a disconnect. And I actually did tell them. And I did so in as gentle a way as I possibly could. And I explained to them that the prisons were full of what they called depression inmates, people who were as straight as they could possibly be, who were facing impossible dilemmas about, do you feed the children or do you cross the line? And so that was a kind of disconnect between the letter and the reality. There were others. In one instant, a woman wrote seeking help for a couple that lived on a farm outside of town. And she said that they were dear friends of hers. And when I did the research, I discovered they were her parents. And there were several instances like that. So, good question.
My question reflects a career in philanthropy, and the heartwarming stories you tell and the secret of it all is what most impressed me, was the fact that philanthropy in this case was anonymous. There are very few people in our society these days who want their philanthropy to be anonymous. They want their names on buildings or whatever. Your grandfather didn't therefore need that, and didn't need that kind of respect. I'm troubled, and I'd be interested to hear you talk about the professionals in our particularly our sports world, who don't get respect when they get millions of dollars. They need more millions of dollars. How would that resonate with your grandfather or with you?
Wow. How many programs do we have to field this one? Well, first I'd have to say that Americans were different then than they are today. It wasn't just a different time, it was a different breed. We were different in 1933. There was a word that was used called, it was enough. Enough. And the word enough had a different resonance than it does today. Usually when we speak of enough today, it's usually in the context of it's not enough. And in those days, when someone uttered enough, it meant we have enough, we can make it. It wasn't a surfeit, it wasn't a surplusage. It was that we would go to bed and not be hungry. We could venture out and not be cold. We could be together, which couldn't be taken for granted always, because when you couldn't feed your children, you sometimes had to farm them out to other families or orphanages or whatever. So the word enough was not just a measure of what you had, it was a measure of who you were and what you were made of. So I think that folks back then, my grandfather included, would have found this a very alien world. He always thought of himself as a peasant and was proud of it. And no matter what the vicissitudes of life were that were thrown at him, whether it was wealth or poverty and back to poverty and back to wealth, he was ready for them because he had enough. You know? It was a different way of looking at life. And so, I aspire to embrace that philosophy. I'm not always successful.
Mr. Gup, I have found myself recently looking at the notion of story and mindful that it is still what we call an article in the newspaper, which is in your field of journalism. And it reminds me that whatever we're reading, we like to be caught up in a narrative, if that's at all possible. You had, every time you pick a subject for a book, you have an interesting opportunity to decide what story you want to tell. And in this situation, you've had an unusual opportunity to look at 150 possible stories and pick the ones that you found most satisfying, most moving. I would ask you to ruminate for a moment from your pretty lofty perch on the nature of story and what are the most compelling elements that you like to weave together to make a good story.
Okay, thank you. Well, my lofty perch is about 2.5 feet tall, but I'll field it. I think for me, I like more than anything else to celebrate the extraordinary and the ordinary. There's no such thing as an ordinary life. I have no interest in the famous. I have no interest in spending my life or time with somebody who's a celebrity. I'm much more interested in the ordinary man and woman and the extraordinary nature of their lives. And so I think the best stories come right out of that. And there's not a soul in this room who, if you didn't drill down a little bit, wouldn't possess a fabulous narrative either about their own lives or their spouses or their parents or grandparents. It's the nature of life. So, we could spend a long time seeking out the exotic, but it's the stuff right in front of us that I like to celebrate. And I think that's the best story. I think that's the best narrative. I don't know if I answered your question, but for me, that's what I naturally gravitate towards.
Mr. Gup, your talk was just fascinating, and we all appreciate it.
Thank you.
But did you know your grandfather? And if you did, what did you remember about him personally? And secondly, how in 33 you said, was he able to accumulate that much money? You said he had just a small store in downtown Canton. It sounds like it was a small fortune, especially at those particular times where he could give it away.
Yeah, good question. Well, so he had $750 he gave away. He had a clothing store. He was in bankruptcy court in 29 with like half the nation, and he was back again in 37 for the second wave of the Great Depression. But in between, he did fine. And 33 was a good year, and he went to work every day and saw the misery around him, and I don't think he could sleep at night because he knew what it was to be hard up. He'd worked in a coal mine. He'd worked washing soda bottles with acid that ate at his fingertips. He'd been duped into being a strike breaker and was bloodied by the strikers and the Pinkertons. So he could identify with these letters. He got it. And he knew what it was like not to have shoes. When they moved into a tenement in Pittsburgh, his own father, hid his shoes so he couldn't go to school, so that he was forced to roll cigars in the tenement factory that his father ran. So, he identified with it, and he wasn't fabulously wealthy in 33, but compared to those around him, he was sitting pretty. Did I know him? I knew him well, and he was a rascal. He's been described as the angel of Canton, but anybody that knew him would not be able to utter those words with a straight face. When I was with him as a kid, and this is not, I'm not joking here, when I was with him as a kid, I felt it was my responsibility to keep him out of trouble. Notwithstanding that he was born an Orthodox Jew, spoke Yiddish and kept kosher until he was 15, he always had a Christmas tree in his home, and notwithstanding that his wife was president of the temple, and on Christmas Day when he had 3 young daughters, he always insisted upon opening his presents first. So he could be selfish as well. He was a lot of fun. He was a lot of fun. And he died in 1981 at age 94, driving to work, trying to beat a drawbridge. Yes. So he was a wonderful, wonderful character, and I'm proud to say my middle name is Samuel. So,
Professor, how did you come across the idea, the fact that your father had falsified his birth certificate? And if I may, a much broader question. In the early 1930s, government had a very, very limited role in providing a safety net for the population, particularly as compared to today. I'd be interested in your comments as to how we got from the late 20s, when there was no safety net, to today.
So the first question, how did I discover that my grandfather's documentation was false? I was eventually provided some materials that showed that he had retained a lawyer in 1940, an immigration lawyer, because in 1940 there was the Alien Registration Act, which said that if you've been here for X number of months, if you don't come forward as an alien, you face deportation or prison. And so he hired a lawyer to try to figure out what he should do, and they approached the Immigration Service without giving his name, just in profile. And he filled out a form to register in which he said, it was always my belief that I was born here, but I could have been wrong. And then he realized, having created all these false documents, that that wasn't going to float. And so he decided he'd go to the grave with the secret. I should say also, when I asked my grandmother about this some years ago, I didn't ask her, was he born in this country, because I didn't know to ask that. I assumed he was born in Pittsburgh. I just said, I can't find any documentation. And she said, as long as I'm alive, you must promise me you'll never ask another question about your grandfather. And he'd passed away by then, and I honored that agreement. I found his name on a passenger list, a ship's list, coming out of La Havre, France in 1902, and that's how I discovered that he definitively was not from born in the States. How did we get from 33 to 2010? How did we get from a nation that was very shy about big government, very distrustful, because we were a nation of immigrants that associated large government with despotism and intrusiveness? There was a lot of hostility towards big government, a lot of suspicion back in 33, and a lot of people came here to escape government. This book is not a political book. You could read this and you could celebrate the resourcefulness of the individual, but you can't make the jump then to the idea that big government is per se bad. I mean, what I take away from reading this is that this week of December 1933 was a pivotal week in our history, actually, and that period, because it was right before the New Deal came into being. The New Deal was still a glint in FDR's eye at this point. He had the CWA, that was a beginnings of what later became the WPA. It was a back to work entity, but nothing had hit the ground. And these people who were so determined to make it on their own, so proud, so fiercely independent, until that period, they would look at people that were out of work and they would say the shiftless poor, and they could separate themselves from those others. But by 1933, 4 years into the Great Depression, you couldn't separate yourself from anyone. And the most resourceful people were unable to make it. And there was a kind of psychological capitulation or realization that there are limits to what an individual can do in this world. There are limits to what neighbors can do for neighbors or family can do for family. That it is not a personal failure when a system fails. And that opened the door to the Great Depression. I mean, to the New Deal. That opened the door to the idea that someone needs to intervene or we're going to starve. We could have been like the Ukraine. In the Soviets at this very period, there were millions of people starving to death. And we could, had government not come to the rescue then, we could have taken a radical shift to the left. I know that there are some there among you who probably feel that we did take a radical shift to the left, but I'm talking about the real deal, 5-year plans and Soviet models. I think that what you see when you read these letters is that at a certain point you have to swallow your pride or tell your kids that they can't swallow any food. That's kind of what it came down to. And a lot of these letters are written by women because the men could afford to be proud, but the women felt compelled to feed the children. And so that's what admitted and allowed for the New Deal, I think. And what I take away from this is that government can't do it all. It's got to be individuals, and we want to restore and regain that sense of self-reliance and independence. But that's not in contradiction to having government there when the system fails. So that's where I come out on it.
Professor, my cousin in Chicago recommended your book to me, and it was recommended to her as the holiday choice at a bookstore. So I was quite surprised that here it was a local book, but it was from outside this area. I've read the book, and I'm struck by the amount of research that was done. An unbelievable amount of research. Were you able to do that all yourself, or do you get assistance? And I have another question. I'm also wondering if you have another book in you.
Do you have an idea? Do you have a suitcase? I did all the research myself, with the exception of hiring some genealogists in Canton at the library, the genealogical library, in the public library, and they were fabulous and great helps. And they helped me to get some leads. But this book is a collaborative effort. It's got my name on it, but it's far better because of my editor. I had a great editor. And I had the help and cooperation of all these families. So this is not a loner's effort. This really is a collaborative work in many ways. My wife helped me at the front end to organize the materials and help select the letters, that I would write, and so it was a joint effort. The research was not work; it was great pleasure. I know I'm on a good book when I'm loath to turn it in. You have a bad book, when you can't wait to get rid of it. I did not want to part with this. This had become my dearest friend, and I really did not want to give it up, but I had to under contract. That's how it is. I don't know what the next subject's going to be. I know what I'd like to do. I have two ideas. One of them is to do the opposite book, which is Bernie Madoff, or to do a book that I'm calling, for lack of a better word, a memoir, but it would be about stories that I've done and what I couldn't write that was a part of those stories. The second one, my agent says, is a stinker. So we'll have to see on that. But I'm going to write what I want to write, because that's the only way I can do anything that means anything to me. So.
Ted, given your background as an investigative journalist and someone who's written about government secrets in the past, particularly your just wonderful book about the men and women who died in the line of fire for the CIA, I'd love to hear your perspective on Mr. Assange and WikiLeaks. Is he a hero, or is he otherwise? Is this the right direction to go, or has he done irreparable harm to the United States?
Well, he's not a hero in my book. I condemn him for what he does. I think he's completely indiscriminate in dumping these materials and irresponsible. When I wrote the book on the CIA, the agency asked me not to write it. This was about the men and women who died in service to the agency. Their identities were erased. It took me 4 years. I found out who they were. I wrote a book about it. And I told the agency what I'd done exactly, because I didn't want to harm anybody. And they came back to me, the director at the time, George Tenet, and asked me to delete the last chapter, which I did for national security reasons and the safety of others. And I wrote a story about the Greenbrier, exposing it as a top-secret relocation site for Congress. Controversial story. I've written a lot of stories that were classified. But I've come into possession of a lot of stories I haven't written and won't, because it could harm people. And by the way, my CIA book is on the reading list for new recruits to the CIA. I didn't harm anybody. But Assange, I don't know what the issue is there that motivates him other than egocentricity. But he hasn't harmed America irreparably. He's caused great embarrassment. He has created some transparency in areas where I think it was welcomed. But it's the indiscriminate nature of what he does that frightens me. And the thing that really frightens me is not so much Assange, but the reaction to him. Because my fear is that we're not going to be able to differentiate between him and the New York Times. My fear is that it's going to set a precedent or create such animosity towards those that write things that are classified that we'll all get swept up in the same, dustbin. And that's my fear. The other thing that I cannot understand is if these hundreds of thousands of documents of such sensitivity are what they say they are, how is it that a private first class had access to all of them? And how did he get all of them out? Because my experience with secrecy is that it's usually need to know, and it's carefully tracked. And this is of a volume and a nature that, at least in my experience, private first class didn't have access to. So I don't quite understand. He must have been in a communication role where, he was at a crossroads where the stuff was flowing. But how is it that he got it out? I don't know. And I think they're going to be copycats to WikiLeaks. That troubles me. But no, I condemn him because you have to use judgment. It's scary enough to make those calls, but not to even feel compelled to make the calls, just to drop it. I don't understand that.
I know there are a few people here that are my age, but I was 8 at the time of the Great Depression, and it conditions you for the rest of your life. In that one, I'm still very frugal. I just can't look at people spending $4 for a cup of coffee, and I really can't. And on the other hand, I have a great love of giving money away because the people that picked us up in the Depression, you never get over the fact that people are generous and they will take care of you. But don't spend money sillily, okay? The only thing it's worth spending it on is education.
I can't top that.
Do you feel that, building off of that, do you feel, having had an opportunity to meet the descendants of the people that had received these gifts, do you feel that that was part of them and that they took that? And, I know I have learned from I have spent $4 on a cup of coffee, but I do it sparingly. But do you feel that that sense of giving back was passed down as well as other things to those people who had received the gift?
I don't think the gift was influential that way because the recipients didn't know about the gift, especially the children that I could interview who are now in their 80s and 90s. They only knew, wow, it was a Christmas in the midst of these bleak times. They didn't know, or it was a dinner, a memorable dinner and a night out and a new dress, but they didn't know the origin of it, so they could not have imported into their value system this gift from Beaver Dot because parents didn't tell parents. Spouses didn't tell spouses. Children didn't tell parents. It just miraculously appeared and changed things. And by the way, it wasn't just those that got the gift that were affected dramatically. It was everyone. The whole town was lifted up. There were people that were contemplating suicide who read this offer and were deeply affected. One of them was a guy named J.L. White. And he said, until I read your offer, and this is a quote, I was thinking thoughts no man should think. And then I realized all was not lost. That's power.
Thank you for being here,
Thank you.
Mr. Gup. The story does my heart good. The story of redemption is always a powerful one for me. And what I'd like to know is what you have learned since doing the research and then writing The Secret Gift. What have you learned about human nature?
Well, I think the biggest thing I've learned is the power of what's little. That it's the earnest, it's the true, it's the sincere that really changes things. It's not the TARPs, it's not the billion-dollar bailouts that holds us together as a community or as a family. It's small things. And people that endured the Great Depression, when they look back on it, they remember these small things. It changed their lives. It defined the landscape. The dog catcher that was called because the dog was foraging for food at a neighbor's because they couldn't afford to feed the dog, and the kids who hid the dog from the dog catcher under the porch because it was all they had in this life. And they muzzled him and they held his legs, and the dog catcher came with a flashlight and held it under the porch and saw the kids there holding the dog and turned the flashlight off and drove away because he didn't have the heart to take it. And those kids remember that 77 years later. Those are the kinds of things that matter. So what I take away from this is the power of the small.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we have been listening to Ted Gup, chairman of the Department of Journalism at Emerson College and author of A Secret Gift. Thank you, Mr. Gup, for your fascinating presentation. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.